Hey everybody, this is forward uh, to the English edition of a pamphlet titled The State and the Socialist Revolution by Julius Martov. It was translated by Integer. I can't think of, I just actually saw this guy's name for the first time today. What the actual name was. One second. What was it for? He translated also Helmut Wagner's analysis of the USSR. So, yeah. I'm trying to think of his name. It's something Hansen or Henson. Maybe Joe. It's not Joe. God. Hermann Jensen. Hermann Jensen is what Integer's real name was. This is originally translated and published in the United States in 1938 and published with International Review. I'd like to know more about this International Review because it seems like it published really cool and important documents in a time when these were not very easily accessible as they are now on the internet. Anyway, this is the foreword, and starts with a quote from State and Revolution. Quote, "What is now happening to Marx's doctrine has in the course of history often happened to doctrines of other revolutionary thinkers and leaders of oppressed classes struggling for emancipation. During the lifetime of great revolutionaries, the oppressing classes have visited relentless persecution on them and received their teachings with the most savage hostility, the most furious hatred, the most ruthless campaign of lies and slanders. After their death, attempts are made to turn them into harmless icons, canonize them, and surround their names with a certain halo for the, quote, consolation, end quote, of the oppressed classes and with the object of duping them, while at the same time emasculating and vulgarizing the real essence of their revolutionary theories and blunting their revolutionary edge. At the present time, the bourgeoisie and the opportunists within the labor movement are cooperating in this work of adulterating Marxism. They omit, obliterate, and distort the revolutionary side of Marxism's teaching, Marxism's revolutionary soul. They push to the foreground and extol what is or seems acceptable to the bourgeoisie. All the social chauvinists are now, quote, Marxists, end quote. Joking aside, exclamation point. And more do German bourgeois professors, erstwhile specialists in the demolition of Marx, speak now of the, quote, national German, end quote, Marx, who, they aver, has educated the splendidly organized working class for the present predatory war. In such circumstances, the distortion of Marxism being so widespread, it is our first task to resuscitate the real teachings of Marx and the state, end quote. Lenin, State and Revolution, page 1. With these splendid sentiments, Lenin began his study of the question of the relation of a socialist revolution to the state. Quote, an urgent problem of the day being concerned with the elucidation for the masses of what the masses have to do for their liberation from the yoke of capitalism in the very near future, end quote. After 20 years of the existence of the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, that was previewed by Lenin in his State and Revolution, it can be said without fear of exaggeration that the feelings expressed by the great Russian statesman in his most important piece of political writing ring as pertinent today as in August 1917 on the eve of the Bolshevik seizure of power. That does not mean that Lenin's, quote, very near future, end quote, of 1917 is any less the wish-thinker's, quote, very near future in 1938, end quote. The, quote, masses, end quote, for whom Lenin presumed to, quote, elucidate, end quote, the question of the state and revolution, apparently did not do what they supposedly had to do to liberate themselves from the yoke of capitalism. It's quite obvious now that the great numbers of the population of capitalist society, the, quote, masses, end quote, to whom Lenin preached from the teacher's height, will learn to do what they have to do for their liberation only after a great deal of experience and further disillusionment, and in spite of the very efforts of some of the shrewdest and most talented teachers. After 20 years of the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, that is extolled as the real thing by Lenin in his magnificently written State and Revolution, the, quote, bourgeoisie and the opportunists, end quote, are still cooperating in the work of, quote, adulterating Marxism, end quote. Quote, Marxist, end quote, professors are still functioning at the task of preparing a, quote, predatory war, end quote. All that is necessary to bring Lenin's impassioned arraignment up to date in the last regard is to strike out, quote, German, end quote, and make reference to another national term. 20 years after the publication of Lenin's, quote, elucidation, end quote, of the question of the relation of a proletarian socialist revolution to the state, the first task is more than ever to, quote, resuscitate the real teachings of Marx on the state, end quote. But of almost equal importance today is the task of tearing away the partly unintentional, partly willful web of confusion thrown over the problem by Lenin and Lenin's followers, the erstwhile resuscitation of the, quote, real teachings, end quote, of Marx. History as it transpired after Lenin had finished his masterpiece History transpired after Lenin had finished his masterpiece on the state, had taught us in practice a lesson that was stressed again and again by Marx in his political writings. Quote, no social order ever disappears before all the productive forces for which there is room within it have been developed, and new higher relations of production never appear before the material conditions of their existence have matured in the womb of the old society, end quote. Parenthesis. Preface to Critique of Political Economy, and parenthesis, neither by, quote, bold leaps, end quote, nor by, quote, legal enactments, end quote, can socialism be installed where socialism's prerequisite economic conditions do not exist. Quote, therefore, mankind always takes up only such problems as mankind can solve, since looking at the matter more clearly, we will always find that the problem itself arises only when the material conditions necessary for the problem's solution already exist, or at least in the presence of formation, end quote. The will and the wide socialist understanding essential for the effective abolition of capitalism can only arise under the conditions of developed capitalism. As a result, the, quote, socialist, end quote, revolution occurring in the backward countries is always a movement in which the great mass is merely in revolt, and only a self-styled, quote, vanguard, end quote, minority is conscious of any socialist aim. This aim, the conscious minority hope to impose on the majority by means of a, quote, benevolent, end quote, dictatorship. Forced by objective facts to abandon the idea of introducing socialism where the conditions for socialism do not exist, and where, therefore, the great mass of the population does not want it, the new rulers, the, quote, vanguard, end quote, minority, who were put in power as a result of the revolution, accommodate themselves in time to the job of administering the socio-economic arrangement permitted by the circumstances on hand. Capitalism, quote, finding power sweet, they develop the century-old technique of intrigue, deception, bribery, and arbitrary violence in order to keep themselves in power. Unable to give the reality of socialism, they learn a new propaganda which consists, crudely put, of calling unregenerate capitalism by a new name, socialism, end quote. Parenthesis, Socialist Standard, November 1934, end parenthesis. And if you don't know, the Socialist Standard is the newspaper, at least I believe it's the newspaper, I feel like I should need to check now, of the Socialist Workers' Party. I mean, not the Socialist Workers' Party, the Socialist Party of Great Britain. Yeah, the Socialist Standard is a monthly socialist magazine published without interruption since September 1904 by the Socialist Party of Great Britain. The magazine is written in a simple, direct style, focuses mainly on socialist advocacy and Marxian analysis of current events, particularly those affecting the United Kingdom. Some articles have been published in party pamphlets. Whatever you think of the Socialist Party of Great Britain, I think Adam Buick and John Crump's work on state capitalism and just defining the general necessary features of a capitalist mode of production in their book, State Capitalism, The Wages System Under New Management, is utterly fantastic. It's a fantastic book. I would say, I might have said this before in other videos, but maybe this is the only video you've ever heard me say, but if I was to recommend to someone an introduction to socialism, I would recommend two things. Hal Draper's The Two Souls of Socialism, but I would also emphasize reading the pamphlet, What is Capitalism? I believe that's what it's called, What is Capitalism? It's funny that I'd recommend it and not even know the title, but basically it's like a zine, it's like a trimmed down version of chapters from the State Capitalism, The Wages System Under New Management, by Adam Buick and John Crump. It's so correct, so like very clearly explains the necessary features of capitalism in a very impressive way that I could only hope to be able to reproduce myself, if I was explaining capitalism to a person on the street. Anyway, according to Marx, the quote, first step in the revolution by the working class, parenthesis, the socialist revolution, end parenthesis, is to raise the proletariat to the position of the ruling class to win the battle of democracy, end quote. Parenthesis, Communist Manifesto, end parenthesis. That is because to be an act for socialism, this revolution can only be, quote, the self-conscious, independent movement of the immense majority in the interests of the immense majority, end quote. Parenthesis, Communist Manifesto, end parenthesis. Quote, after its victory, the sole organization which the proletariat finds already in existence is precisely the state. This state may require very considerable alterations before it can fulfill its new functions, end quote. Lenin, end quote, Engels, letter to Van Patten, April 18th, 1883. For, quote, the working class cannot simply seize the available machinery of the state and set the available machinery of the state in motion for the working class's own ends, end quote. Marx, Civil War in France, Chapter 3. Quote, at the best, the state is an evil inherited by the proletariat after the proletariat's victorious struggle for class supremacy, and whose worst features the proletariat will have to lop off at once, as the Commune did, until such time as a new generation, reared under new free social conditions, will be in a position to rid itself of this state rubbish in its entirety, end quote. Engels, 1891 preface to Civil War in France. The first task of the victorious socialist revolution, the self-conscious movement of the immense majority in the interest of the immense majority, is not, quote, merely to hand over from one set of hands to another the bureaucratic and military machine, as has occurred hitherto, but to shatter the bureaucratic and military machine, and it is this that is the preliminary condition of any real people's revolution on the continent, end quote. Parenthesis, Marx, letter to Kugelmann, April 12, 1871, end parenthesis. In order to wield the power of the state in behalf of a socialist transformation of society, the victorious immense majority must immediately make certain fitting alterations in the state. What alterations? The bureaucratic and military features of the existing state must be immediately lopped off. The bureaucratic military machinery of the state must be replaced with greater popular rule and the extension of democracy. The state must be immediately democratized from top to bottom. As indicated by Marx and Engels, the socialist revolution begins with this political change, the greatest possible extension of democracy. For no other way can socialism, the common ownership and democratic social control of the means of production and distribution, be made real. This is true where a socialist revolution is made possible by existing material conditions. but the minority of, quote, vanguard, end quote, revolutionizers, put in power by the social eruption that has occurred in a backward country, face a different problem and objectively a different aim. In view of the backwardness of the country whose destiny, quote, the vanguard, end quote, politicians attempt to fashion, the very hopes and presentation of the new rulers call not for the, quote, lopping off, end quote, but, in the manner of all previous pro-capitalist revolutions, for the strengthening, for the perfection of the bureaucratic military state machinery. The world has never seen the like. One second. Sorry. Where am I at? The world has never seen the like of the bureaucratic military machine that was born of the national Russian Revolution. Only now are state machines fashioned by the Italian fascists and the German Nazis beginning to rival the bureaucratic military, quote, perfection, end quote, that has been attained in the post-revolutionary Russia. In Lenin's half-naive, half-cunning, quote, pre-election, end quote, promise of 1917, very unlike the grim, is Lenin's half-naive, half-cunning, quote, pre-election, end quote, promise of 1917, very unlike the grim Soviet reality of today. It is nevertheless true that the, quote, ideological, end quote, stuff by means of which the great Soviet hoax is perpetrated, parenthesis, as much at the cost of the international working class as at the expense of the Russian people, end parenthesis, is tapped from Lenin's State and Revolution. Footnote. Quote, ideology, end quote, in this case means, quote, rationalization, end quote. The trick of, quote, justifying or concealing the real cause or motive by a reason, accepted by consciousness which is not in accord with the actual, parenthesis, unconscious, end parenthesis, determining facts, end quote. End footnote. I say end footnote already. Right. In his State and Revolution, and on the eve of Bolshevik conquest of power, Lenin manipulated craftily some vague formulae found in Marx's civil war in France. Quote, these formulae were sufficiently motivated by the immediate need of the General Council, parenthesis, of the First International, end parenthesis, to defend the Commune of 1871, parenthesis, directed by the Hébertists and Proudhonists. Let's see if I can copy and paste out of this document. I haven't tried it yet. The Hébertists, or exaggerators, were a radical revolutionary political group associated with the populist journalist Jacques Hébert, a member of the Cordelier Club. They came to power during the Reign of Terror and played a significant role in the French Revolution. The Hébertists, or the Héberists, were ardent supporters of the de-Christianization of France and of extreme measures in service of the terror, including the law of suspects enacted in 1793. They favored the direct intervention of the state in economic matters in order to ensure the adequate supply of commodities, advocating the national requisition of wine and grain. The leaders went to the guillotine on the 24th of March, 1794. Back to the text. Quote, these formulae were sufficiently motivated by the immediate need of the General Council, parenthesis, of the First International, end parenthesis, to defend the Commune of 1871, parenthesis, directed by the Hébertists and the Proudhonists, end parenthesis, against its enemies. But they did away almost completely with the margin existing between the thesis of the, quote, conquest of political power, end quote, presented by the Marxists, and the idea of the, quote, destruction of the state, end parenthesis, held by the anarchists. Quote, On the eve of the revolution of October 1917, Lenin used these formulae with such good effect Sorry, I don't know if there's a quote before that. I don't know if they ever closed. Anyway, quote, on the eve of the revolution of October 1917, Lenin used these formulae with such good effect that he accumulated in his theses of state and revolution as many contradictions as were found in the heads of all the members of the Commune, Jacobins, Blanquists, Hébertists, Proudhonians, and anarchists. Objectively, this was necessary, unrealized without doubt by Lenin himself, so that an attempt to create a state machinery very similar in its structure to the former military and bureaucratic type, and controlled by a few adherents, might be presented to the mass of the population, which is then in a condition of revolutionary animation, as the destruction of the old state machinery, as the rise of a society based on a minimum of repression and discipline, as the birth of a stateless society. At a moment when the revolutionary mass expressed its revolt against the centuried yoke of the old state by forming, quote, autonomous republics of Kronstadt, and trying anarchist experiments as, quote, direct workers' control, etc., at that moment, the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat and the poorest peasants, end quote, said to be incarnated in the real dictatorship of the, quote, true, end quote, interpreters of the proletariat and poorest peasants, that is, the chosen of Bolshevist communism, could only consolidate itself by first dressing itself in such anarchist and anti-state ideology, Quote, fundamentally, the anarchist... this is a continuation of the quote. Forget that quote. Fundamentally, the anarchist illusion of the destruction of the state covers up the tendency to concentrate all the state power of constraint in the hands of a minority which believes neither in the objective logic of the revolution nor in the class consciousness of the international proletarian majority, and with still less reason that of the national majority. The idea that the, quote, Soviet system, end quote, is equal to a definite break with all the former bourgeois forms of revolution, therefore serves as a screen behind which, imposed by exterior factors and the inner conformation of the proletariat, there are set afoot methods that have featured the bourgeois revolution. And those revolutions have always been accomplished by transferring the power of a, quote, conscious minority supporting itself on an and those revolutions have always been accomplished by transferring the power of a, quote, conscious minority supporting itself on an unconscious majority, end quote, to another minority finding itself in an identical situation, end quote. This is Julius Martov speaking in 1919. With these words, Julius Martov has uncovered for us the, quote, catch, end quote, hiding behind the splendid sentiments that fill the pages of State and Revolution. Martov has disclosed for us the secret of Sovietism. Who was Martov? A Russian Marxist whose personality and ideas were so awkwardly avoided in Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution. Plekhanov, Martov, and Lenin are the three important names of the Russian revolutionary movement. Martov died a tubercular, poverty-stricken Martov died a tubercular, poverty-stricken exile in 1923. To understand Martov's peculiar position in Russian history, we must think of Lenin, the successful, practical statesman who, quote, arrived, end quote, and is now reposing in embalmed effigy under the magnificent mausoleum on Red Square. We must think of the painted pharaoh god, in whose name the Russian people labor to hold up a pyramidal structure which, with the aid of verses culled from the dead one's legacy, is described as socialism. We must think of the successfully dead Lenin, whose writings are edited, newly marshaled, and re-edited in millions of volumes by hundreds of subsidized publishers all over the world, whose wise sayings and supposed wise sayings are the subject of rapt exegesis by bevies of learned commentators, in whose writings all kinds of parties and partylets, from the powerful concern holding the Russian people in its grip to hundreds of splinter grouplets pottering about in the bohemian nooks of Europe and America, find their ideological support and spiritual sustenance. Neither Stalin, the vicar of Lenin on earth, nor Fenner Brockway, speaking for the recently Leninized Independent Labour Party of Great Britain, failed to track down a text in the dead Lenin before enunciating their last message to the, quote, masses, end quote. Lenin, who has become the subject of theses written by doctoral candidates for the license to profess certified Marxism-Leninism! Exclamation point. Lenin, now a mythological personage that grave professors in Moscow and elsewhere avow to be the Jesus to whom Marx was but an annunciatory John the Baptist! Exclamation point. Lenin's, quote, success, end quote, offers us a clue to Martov's character and viewpoint. Martov was one of the founders and collaborators on the Iskra, the publication around which the Russian social democracy developed. In the break that took place at the Party Congress of 1903, Martov represented the, quote, minority against the, quote, majority, parenthesis, Bolshinstvo, end parenthesis, which was led by Lenin. The split was motivated especially by the question of party organization. Martov upheld the Western idea of an inclusive democratic party in contrast to Lenin's thesis of a party of, quote, professional revolutionists, end quote, controlled militarily by a, quote, central committee, end quote. It is interesting to observe that even in 1903, Martov recognized that a party of Lenin's style really, quote, belonged, end quote, to the czarist scene, and playing a dominant role might seize power in a national revolution. However, Martov always asked, quote, power for what, end quote. Transcending Menshevism, parenthesis, which in contrast to the more truly national Russian Bolshevik section, dreamt of transplanting the ways and program of Western reformism to the land of the czars, end parenthesis, Martov looked for the rise of a real movement for socialism in the advanced countries of the West. We can understand that a person in his situation had no reason to be very enthusiastic concerning the near future. Martov, a product of the Russian revolutionary movement, was unfortunate enough to be able to see beyond the Russian scene and, quote, laborism, end quote, in general. The event of the Russian Revolution showed again that the habit of probing behind appearances does not go to make a successful politician. Martov, the clear-thinking social scientist, was not a successful politician, dead or alive. Martov will not go down in history as one of Russia's great statesmen, like, say, Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, Lenin the Great, Stalin the Great. Sorry, there's a footnote I missed. It says, there is now apparent in radical literary circles a tendency to impute to Lenin all quotable wisdom that used to be credited to Lincoln, Barnum, Engels, Marx, Disraeli, and even Pushkin. End footnote. In the midst of the upheaval of 1917, Martov located his evaluation of the Russian revolutionary problem in the framework of extended historic development. Martov saw what lay ahead and said so, thus placing himself in the position of a helpless Jeremiah. Martov recognized the Russian Revolution to be a progressive, pro-capitalist national revolution that cleared the way for the solution of the economic backwardness of the country. Martov recognized the Russian Revolution as a, quote, bourgeois, end quote, revolution, directed in part by the proletariat and impregnated with the utopianism typical of the proletariat of a backward country. Martov emphasized that the dictatorship of the Bolshevik, quote, professional revolutionists, end quote, was not to be confused with the, quote, dictatorship, end quote, of the working class, which according to Martov was impossible in a country like Russia. Martov foresaw that the pretensions to a program of world revolution, affected by the Bolsheviks during their, quote, heroic, end quote, period, served as a sort of camouflage to protect their rule, and would in time give way to the program of Russian, quote, national socialism, end quote, the traditional and real program of Bolshevism. We have here an explanation of the plight of his own little group of, quote, internationalists, end quote, who in the first revolutionary Soviet congresses rejected both the Menshevik and Bolshevik positions. Martov stressed that the Bolshevik dictatorship of 1918 to 1919 was a revolutionary dictatorship which had risen into power on the crest of the popular protest against adverse conditions and the continuation of the war. While Martov opposed in speech and writing the Bolshevik strangling of democracy and suppression of civil rights, Martov indicated that the Bolshevik dictatorship was, at its beginning at least, joined ideologically and socially to the Russian international labor movement. The man who predicted that Lenin would beget Stalin opposed in his time any attempt to overthrow the Bolshevik dictatorship by force. During the Civil War, he called on the labor opponents of the Bolsheviks to join the Red Army to fight against Denikin, Wrangel, and the foreign interventionists. By the end of 1920, the power of the makeshift parliamentary bodies, Soviets, that arose in Russia at the beginning of the revolution had been entirely replaced, as Martov foresaw, by the rule of the Communist Party. There was no longer any place in the country for a person like Martov. A very amusing instance of Lenin's Bolshevik, quote, realism, end quote, was Lenin's public order to the police not to trouble Martov, while in accordance with private instructions, the Bolshevik Gestapo made Martov understand it would be decidedly more healthful for him to remove himself from the country. For Martov had made himself a nuisance by speaking out against the imposition of capital punishment, contrary to the first Soviet constitution, on pro-labor non-Bolsheviks who were merely guilty of having different political opinions. And Martov had spoken out against the habit of the Bolshevik bureaucratic military machine of dealing with their political opponents without benefit of trial by jury. For the ideas later expressed in Lenin's famous quote to Kursky began to be put in practice as soon as the Bolshevik machine had been securely installed in power, and Martov's prestige in the Russian revolutionary movement interfered with the new dictatorship. Footnote. The note in question was written by Lenin on May 15th, 1922. It was addressed to D.I. Kursky, who was the Commissar of Justice at that time. It was written in reference to one of the articles of the Soviet Criminal Code under consideration in May 1920. Here it is, 15th of May, 1922. Oh no, it said consideration in May 1922. Here it is, 15th of May, 1922. I said 1920 before, but that was because the blemish on the PDF I'm reading. Comrade Kursky, quote, Comrade Kursky, in my opinion, it is necessary to extend the application of execution by shooting, with the substitution of exile abroad, see Article 1 below, to all phases covering the activities of Mensheviks, social revolutionaries, and the like. A formula must be found that would place these activities in connection with the international bourgeoisie and its struggle against us, bribery of the press and agents, war preparations, and the like. Please return this quickly with your reply, Lenin. Sorry, that last bit was in italics, so I'm going to read it again. A formula must be found that would place these activities in connection with the international bourgeoisie and its struggle against us, bribery of the press and agents, war preparations, and the like, Please return this quickly with your reply, Lenin. Lenin's note was published in the Bolshevik, end quote. Lenin's note was, Jesus Christ. Lenin's note was published in the Bolshevik, Moscow, issue of January 15, 1937, page 63, just before the trial of the 17, Radik, Sokolnikov, et al., It was accompanied by the following comment by the savants of the Marx-Engels-Lenin Institute. Quote, the note to Comrade Kursky was written by Vladimir Ilyich, on the reverse side of the first page, presented to him in printed form of the project for the supplementary law in the criminal code. Next to paragraph 5 of the law, which dealt with the application of capital punishment for counter-revolutionary expressions against the Soviet (Bolshevik) and government, Lenin wrote on the first page below, quote, "Add the right to substitute for execution, exile abroad, by decision of the All-Russian CEC (for a period of years or without limit." End quote. It was this postscript that Lenin had in mind. There's supposed to be an end of parenthesis, but there is not. End quote. It was this postscript that Lenin had in mind in reference to the note to Kursky above. The note to Kursky emphasized the need for capital punishment for the counter-revolutionary activities of Mensheviks, SRs, and, quote, the like, end quote. Lenin demanded capital punishment for the counter-revolutionary activities of anti-Soviet parties connected with the war preparations of the international bourgeoisie against the Soviet Republic and with other forms of the fight of international capitalism against our country. That demand of Lenin's is likewise entirely applicable to the Trotskyist-Zinovieist agents of the Gestapo who acted by direct orders of fascism and are a counter-revolutionary gang of bandits, spies, and diversionists, vicious enemies of the land of toilers. That's all in italics. I'm going to repeat it then. That demand of Lenin's is likewise entirely applicable to the Trotskyist-Zinovieist agents of the Gestapo who acted by direct orders of fascism and are a counter-revolutionary gang of bandits, spies, and diversionists, vicious enemies of the land of toilers. These scoundrels, murderers of Comrade Kirov, are precisely such enemies of the Soviet Republic for whom Vladimir Ilyich demanded severe revolutionary punishment. End quote. And that was the note that was attached to, by the press, attached to this note from Lenin, which was published in Bolshevik Moscow on January 15th, 1937, page 63. Anyway, end footnote. There's a big footnote. For the ideas later expressed in Lenin's famous note to Kursky began to be put in practice as soon as the Bolshevik machine had been securely installed in power and Martov's prestige in the Russian revolutionary movement interfered with the new dictatorship. But even during his years of exile, Martov, while he pointed out the historic meaning of the new Russian dictatorship that had replaced Tsarism, opposed with untiring propaganda the economic blockade of Russia and the campaign of reactionary vilification then carried on against the Bolshevik government in Western Europe. What does Martov mean to us? Why have we taken the trouble to present to the English-speaking workers the writings of this Russian social democrat? We have taken the trouble to present the writings of Martov, a Russian social democrat, to the English-speaking workers because his writings have a definite value in the socialist propaganda of our time. Martov's usefulness to the still weak international movement for socialism lies precisely in the fact that he is little more than a social democrat and a Russian social democrat. It lies in his ability to withstand, at least in part, the drag of the specifically Russian milieu that created Menshevism and Bolshevism, the two wings of Russian, quote, laborism, end quote. It lies in his ability to consider the event of the Russian Revolution from the angle of the future movement for socialism, rather than from the viewpoint of militant or less militant, westernized or boldly national historic opportunism. Though he was part and parcel of the Russian revolutionary movement, Julius Martov attempted the feat of evaluating from the angle of historic objectivity the events in which Martov was himself an actor. The Russian upheaval has had a curious influence on the international movement for socialism, introducing themselves under the guise of opposites to the old social democratic organizations. The militant communist parties, organized in all countries after the Bolshevik victory, tried to hitch the post-war discontent to the wagon of the national Russian Revolution. If popular comprehension of the socialist goal is a necessary condition for the socialist revolution, then the Communist parties will go down in the history of the labor movement as a force that did a mighty bit to divert, for some time, the attention of the international working class from its task of self-emancipation. In this game of partly unconscious deception, the issue of, quote, Sovietism, end quote, has played and continues to play an important role. Martov, writing at the time of the greatest enthusiasm over the prospects of, quote, Soviet, end quote, uprisings and, quote, Soviet, end quote, governments, shows up this deception. To anybody who can and would read, the essays gathered in this book offer an effective antidote against the Leninist and, quote, left communist, end quote, confusion that has addled so many brains since 1918. Footnote. I'm referring to the naive people who, while repudiating Bolshevism, say, quote, it must be Soviets, end quote, without asking themselves how and where these makeshift representative bodies arose and what purpose they served in behalf of the shrewd politicians who rode the Soviets to power. End footnote. Let me repeat that sentence. To anybody who can and would read, the essays gathered in this book offer an effective antidote against the Leninist and, quote, left communist, end quote, confusion that has addled so many brains since 1918, and that remains a very important need in spite of the effective work of clarification already achieved by historic experience itself. In the essays gathered in this book, Martov may be said to perform for the Russian Revolution a service parallel that done by Marx for the Paris Commune in his Civil War in France. I wrote, quote, paralleling, end quote, because the primary need in the case of Martov's study of the Russian Revolution is not to describe the tasks and program of a, quote, people's revolution, end quote, but to refute a historic hoax, which, as was seen quite early by Martov, imperils the cause of the increase of the socialist consciousness of the international working class. Of a necessity, Martov's treatment of the illusions manipulated by the Bolshevik politicians in 1918 also brings out Martov's general political and social stand. Martov expected the workers themselves to accomplish their emancipation. Martov believed that with historic experience, the working class would undergo a political and moral development and overcome in time the current utopias and swindles in political theory and practice fostered among them by various sets of, quote, leaders, end quote. Martov understood that the socialist revolution could only take place in countries that were economically ripe for socialism. He understood that the political setup produced by the socialist revolution could never be the Jacobin dictatorship of a revolutionary minority, but could only be the expression of the majority rule of the population. Martov believed that after the proletariat of the countries economically ripe for socialism had once seized power, it could never find itself in a situation where its rule was anything else but the majority of the population. In spite of the object lessons taught by the events of the past 20 years, so many, quote, advanced revolutionists, end quote, still find such ideas not, quote, revolutionary, end quote, enough. Martov had a pitying smile both for the, quote, revolutionist a la mode, end quote, the revolutionary bohemian, and the, quote, practical, end quote, opportunists, the, quote, Kaisers and King Socialist, end quote. Martov's study of the political methods and the historic significance of the Russian Revolution is dedicated to the, quote, increase and development of the socialist consciousness, end quote, of the working class of the world. Considered from the standpoint of this purpose, political fashions in Bohemia and current tricks of opportunist, quote, practicalness, end quote, are important only as usually unconscious means of diverting the attention of the populace from their historic task. The first two sections of this book, the ideology of Sovietism and the conquest of the state, were written early in 1919. They form a compact whole and should be read as such. The first essay appeared serially in the periodical Mysl of Kharkov. The introductory section of the second was first published in the issues of July 8th and September 1st, 1921, the Sozialistische Vestnik, Berlin, end parenthesis. The remainder of the second essay appeared for the first time in Mrvovoy Bolshevism, parenthesis, World Bolshevism, and parenthesis, Berlin, 1923, from the text of which the entire present translation was made. The final section, entitled Marx and the Problem of the Dictatorship of the Proletariat, was first published in 1918 in the Workers' International of Moscow, edited by Martov. It deals with the same subject from a more general point of view. Signed, Integer, which again was, what's his name? God, I need to remember this. Come on. Herman Jensen. Thank you so much for listening.